Good afternoon and welcome to the July 17th, 2024 City Council work session. Thank you for joining us in this virtual meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And thank you again for joining us. And with that, I call this July 17, 2024 City Council work session to order. And I will turn it over to the city manager to introduce the one and only topic of today's work session.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. It feels like it was about a year ago that we were talking about decarbonizing buildings. And so you had directed us to do a lot of work around engaging the community in this conversation and also doing an overview of new construction strategies we were seeing, research we were doing. And so staff is here today to walk you through that conversation. And I believe Ian is leading that. Yeah. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, City Manager, and good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I am Ian Penn, Sustainability Manager, and joining me today are Emily Jerome, Deputy City Attorney, and Danielle Klinkabel, Climate Policy Analyst. So just a quick agenda. I'm going to provide a little bit of background on the legal landscape and the motion behind today's work session. Then I'm going to walk through an overview of strategies from local governments to promote electrification or reduce fossil fuel use in new buildings. And really, because a number of these approaches align with what staff discussed last week, I'm going to highlight some points of alignment there. And then finally, just some thoughts and reflecting on this research as well as staff's engagements. So more information on the Ninth Circuit Berkeley decision is in the AIS, but in brief, in 2019, the city of Berkeley passed an ordinance prohibiting natural gas infrastructure in new buildings. This was challenged in courts, and ultimately the Ninth Circuit ruled that the ordinance was preempted by federal law. But I think this case underscores some of the challenges cities are facing in finding ways to meet some of their climate goals. In addition, following the repeal of a similar ordinance here, Council, as City Manager said, directed research into alternative approaches to reduce fossil fuel use in new buildings. And so today is really an opportunity to provide a broad overview of the various approaches from different cities, offering a general snapshot of current practices in this area. And so as some of this research was taking place, staff uncovered a wide range of approaches under consideration or that have been implemented by cities. But as we continued to gather examples, these approaches really started to fall under some common themes. And that really provided an organizing framework for these approaches that you see here in front of you. And while research has shown us that there's a lot of variation and nuance in what cities are doing, I really wanted to try and stay out of the weeds as much as possible. And I know I like to get in the weeds sometimes, but really what I'm presenting today is more of a general set of strategies that fall under these 7 themes. I'm going to have a few city-specific examples, but I'm going to include those because I think they provide instructive context for some of these approaches. I also wanted to note that staff are not necessarily viewing these approaches as a menu of options, but rather a survey of strategies and policies other cities are considering or have implementing. So the first area is incentivizing electrification. And so a number of approaches under here. So one is permitting. So cities promote electrification through their building permit processes. Some cities prioritize or expedite applications for all electric new construction by reducing or waiving permit fees or offering expedited review processes. Voluntary programs is another area. These encourage developers to exceed baseline code requirements, often including incentives like density bonuses for meeting certain sustainability criteria. Some cities also have recognition programs, acknowledging developers who implement beyond code requirements or meet nationally recognized building standards like LEED. And then financial incentives. This primarily includes rebates, tax credits, low interest loans, really with a goal to help offset the upfront cost of electric technologies. We weren't finding a lot of cities, directly funding incentives for new building electrification, but there are a few examples. The city of Denver is probably the most robust example that we found. It actually has a pilot program in place that's a rebate program for all electric new buildings and homes, For this program, rebates are funded through a voter-approved sales tax-fed climate protection fund, and is really part of a larger incentive program that Denver runs. So Denver, through this fund, gets a lot of money every year, and they've peeled off some of that money to fund this pilot program for new construction. Other examples that we saw typically involve cities that had city-owned utilities that were providing incentives. So in Oregon, Ashland Electric is an example of this. And while they're not city-owned, they're customer-owned. EWEB itself also has incentives for new construction. ETO does as well. So that's kind of a similar function that we have locally. Sources of incentives did vary. So a few cities are using grants or philanthropic sources. A handful of cities are using dedicated voter-approved climate funds like Denver. And then for cities with municipal utilities, they're using ratepayer revenue that's often supplemented by state or federal resources. And so while some cities are focusing on incentives, others aim to disincentivize fossil fuel use in new construction. So these strategies don't ban energy options, but rather make fossil fuel less appealing by increasing their cost and administrative complexity. And through research, we really see this through two pathways: fees and permitting. So for carbon impact fees or climate impact fees, these fees are really based on the projected greenhouse gas emissions of a new building over its lifespan. These fees, which are calculated and levied upfront during a building project, are a market-based approach, really with a goal to internalize the external cost of greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. The other pathway that we saw was modifying permit requirements for new buildings that use fossil fuels. So cities might require extra documentation for environmental compliance, for example, detailed energy models, or they'll eliminate access to things like expedited permit review processes for buildings. These measures increase time, cost, administrative burdens for projects, really with a goal to encourage developers to consider lower carbon alternatives. Something a number of cities have been doing is adopting policies that eliminate fossil fuel use or require the use of low carbon fuels like renewable diesel in new construction and major renovations of city-owned and operated buildings. Cities are doing this really for a number of reasons. I think one, by ensuring that new public buildings do not use fossil fuels, cities directly reduce their own footprints. I think two, it can help provide real-world demonstrations of the feasibility of all electric and low-carbon energy buildings. I think third, through these projects, cities hope they can identify and address technical challenges, and those do exist. Developing best practices that can be shared with other institutions and possibly even in the private sector. And then finally, education. I think a building can itself be an educational tool. And cities see their buildings as an opportunity for public education, allowing community members to see and experience technologies and approaches firsthand. And that really leads to the fourth theme, which is education and awareness. And this is critical to the success of any sustainability initiative. So many cities have developed comprehensive awareness campaigns to inform people about incentives, actions they can take, often highlighting success stories and the positive impacts of reducing emissions from buildings. Many cities also organize workshops or webinars for a wide range of audiences, for residents, for developers. These events cover topics like electrification, efficiency, incentives, offering a much more hands-on learning experience than simply taking information and throwing it over the transom. Some cities have living labs or demonstration projects where where people can experience innovative technologies and all electric buildings firsthand. And through research and through conversation, outreach and education seem particularly important in states with what are called energy choice laws. And so these are laws that prevent local governments from implementing Berkeley-style ordinances or other similar measures. There's 25 or 26 states now that have these laws. And so in these states, cities are relying heavily on education programs to encourage voluntary adoption of electric technologies. Technical assistance was another area. So some cities offer guidance on building design, construction techniques, even compliance with green building standards. This can range from consultations to hands-on training. And then business support. Several cities are helping businesses identify energy efficiency opportunities, building evaluations, using energy audits, information on incentives. While a lot of these programs focus on existing buildings, some cities also apply them to new construction, focusing on the building plan rather than the building operation. Cities also have local regulations, so there is regulation in this space as well. These vary quite a bit based on local priorities and local authorities, but generally fall in a few key categories. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the first two items as they're not particularly viable in Oregon, but I think they're important to highlight because they represent the majority of city regulatory approaches being used in this space right now. So some cities, predominantly outside of the Ninth Circuit, continue to restrict fossil fuel infrastructure in new buildings. There aren't very many of these, but they do exist. Reach codes are another common approach that we saw. These are local building codes. There's just a primer. These are local building ordinances that exceed state minimum requirements for new buildings. They often focus on sustainability or energy efficiency. In states where cities can implement reach codes, policies include electric-only new construction, electric-ready new construction, which is often called future-proofing, and then much stricter energy efficiency standards for mixed-fuel buildings. Emission standards, this is sort of a newer approach for cities, and it's being applied to both buildings and appliances. So broadly, these standards regulate the performance of appliances or buildings by setting limits on air pollution. So for example, New York City has implemented CO2 emission limits for new buildings and major renovations over a certain building size. Other cities are considering or have implemented nitrogen oxide or NOx emission standards for appliances, really focusing on appliances that vent to the outside, so furnaces, hot water heaters. This approach, which is being explored by the city of Ashland, is inspired by California's Air District, which have long regulated NOx emissions under the Clean Air Act and recently set much more stringent limits on heating appliances. And then lastly, some cities are exploring other regulatory pathways. So for example, some of them are considering restricting the expansion of new fossil fuel infrastructure in public rights-of-way in previously undeveloped or unserved areas. So not existing infrastructure or already developed neighborhoods, but rather to unserved areas. There were no examples of this having been implemented, but some cities are discussing this and have been considering this. As today's focus is on city approaches, they might be wondering why I'm also covering state policy, and really it's to recognize how state level policies support and enable local efforts. And one of the big ways they do that is through building code. And so many states are setting increasingly strict energy efficiency standards for new buildings. For example, Washington State recently adopted a building code designed to comply with EPCA, and EPCA again is the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. This is the federal law at the center of the Berkeley case. And so this code that Washington has passed emphasizes higher energy performance in buildings, encourages the use of highly energy efficient appliances. While there is ongoing legal challenge to this law right now, implementation is proceeding up in Washington. States also offer incentives for all electric new residential construction. So an example is California's Electric Homes Program. This provides incentives for market rate new housing. California also has a similar program for affordable housing. A similar idea to this was actually proposed by Governor Kotek as part of her housing proposal in the most recent strategy legislative session, but it didn't pass. There is money in the budget for buildings. It's mostly focused on existing buildings with a particular focus on affordable housing. There's also money for heat pumps, which could be for new buildings or existing buildings. Several states have passed legislation that enable what are called thermal energy networks. And so these networks function very similarly to fossil gas pipelines, but rather than delivering fossil fuel to be combusted in a building, instead distribute thermal energy. So for example, geothermal energy. This is really seen as an alternative way for two things. One, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to provide efficient heating and cooling. And this sort of legislation also helps create conditions for pilot projects. And I'll talk about a pilot in just a second. And in fact, for utility participation, this legislation might actually be required in certain states. And then last, utility commissions. So state utility commissions can support city efforts by creating policies or rules that encourage electrification or discourage fossil fuel use in buildings. For example, and this is a gross simplification of this law, but based on a 2021 law, the Colorado Public Utilities Commission is directing investor-owned utilities to establish energy-saving targets and promote energy-efficient electric equipment over fossil fuel-based systems. And there's nuance and more detail in this law with some criteria that have to be surpassed to make sure you proceed, but that's the kind of the gist. And for cities in Colorado, they really view this as an important tool in helping them meet their local climate goals. And last are existing buildings. And cities see work on existing buildings as an important complement to new buildings because one, it allows them to address emissions from the entire building sector. And two, they recognize that today's new buildings could be subject to a number of policies as they age. And so through research, some of the approaches that we've seen with existing buildings include building performance standards or BPS. It sets energy performance levels for existing buildings, encouraging energy efficiency and reduced fossil fuel use over time. Under a BPS, building owners have flexibility in choosing strategies to meet these targets. So this is not prescriptive. This is a performance-based approach for doing things. And I'll note that the state of Oregon is currently working on a state-level rule for a building performance standard, and that rulemaking is ongoing, and we expect a rule sometime late this year or early next year. Energy benchmarking, these are policies that focus on larger buildings and require building owners to report their energy use, so there's transparency about that. So benchmarking tracks and compares energy performance over time and between buildings. And oftentimes these are paired with building performance standards. So you benchmark first, you come up with a metric, and then you create the standard that you have to meet. Decommissioning is another area. So some energy utilities are helping cities reduce fossil fuel use in existing buildings through what they call system decommissioning. So for example, in California, Pacific Gas and Electric has been decommissioning aging methane gas infrastructure and replacing it with electric alternatives. They've completed about 100 or so smaller projects in their service territory so far. And in Albany, California, the city has a pilot to electrify an entire block. Hasn't started yet, but they have a goal for doing this. And they want to then decommission the corresponding fossil fuel infrastructure. And in Albany, PG&E has actually worked with and helped the city identify suitable locations for doing this pilots. For some utilities, and I'll emphasize some, in particular combined gas and electric utilities, decommissioning is seen as a strategic approach to existing fossil fuel infrastructure, helping them sort of address multiple challenges at the same time. This can include meeting climate goals, whether their own internal goals or state goals, helping mitigate risk. There can be an equity component to this, and it helps avoid things like stranded assets. So long-lived infrastructure that has a 40 or 50, 60-year lifespan that has to be maintained and paid for over that time. And then last, geothermal pilots. So as staff mentioned last week, some cities are exploring network geothermal systems to provide efficient, low-carbon heating and cooling to multiple buildings at the same time. So for example, there's a city in Massachusetts that is piloting a network geothermal project in partnership with its local utility. So many cities and many utilities are closely watching this pilot. There's a lot of interest in this pilot. And with recent legislation in Washington state enabling those thermal energy networks that I mentioned, staff expect to see pilots emerge there as well. And so with that sort of broad survey, I wanted to sort of spend a little time and highlight where and how these 7 themes I've just covered align with 2 things. One are the strategies that emerge from engagement on building decarb, which staff presented to council last week, and then actions that are outlined in CAP 2.0. And so this table, which spans 2 slides, is a crosswalk between the themes and approaches I just discussed, the 16 decarb strategies from last week, and then CAP 2.0 actions. And so the left column focuses on themes rather than the approaches under each theme. And I thought this provided a clearer illustration of alignments and a more consistent framework to do this crosswork. So that's why I focused on themes rather than some of those approaches that I've talked about. I recognize there's a lot of information in this table, so I'm happy to answer questions. But what I found interesting was all the alignment in a couple of areas. And so incentives, incentivizing preferred outcomes, incentivizing preferred behavior. This was a frequent topic in engagement. I think pretty much every focus group or conversation staff had. The idea of incentives came up. The idea of incentives is also prominent in CAP 2.0, removing process barriers, promoting incentives, considering new incentives. So that theme, was pretty consistent there as well. Outreach and education, raising awareness. I think engagement for us highlighted that lack of awareness is a really big challenge for residents, for businesses, understanding what's available, incentives that are there. There's a big need to help, raise awareness of these things. And the idea of education and capacity building and outreach is woven throughout CAP 2.0. On buildings, on transportation, on waste, it's everywhere. It's really embedded in the fabric of that document. And then the impact and importance of state level policy. It was interesting to revisit some CAP actions, like seeking statutory authority to adopt state REACH code as base code here, sort of how that policy idea unfolded over time, and the reality that all of this continues to evolve. And so that was a very specific CAP action back in 2019, 2020. It's kind of come and gone. But the broader idea of the interplay between state policy and local action still exists, just in different forms with different policies. I wanted to also address 2 themes that didn't necessarily have strategies from engagements, that's city-owned facilities and regulations. So for city-owned facilities, public institutions, including city staff, were a focus group. And while what was learned from that discussion does show up in the 16 strategies, nothing emerged that was city facility specific in terms of a strategy. Also, our climate recovery ordinance includes a zero carbon goal. And while we use offsets to meet that goal today, we're also working toward it through investment in our own facilities. And then on local regulation, we heard a lot of perspectives during engagement, and staff hinted at some of that. And there's more detail on that in the decarb report, engagement report as well. But there was no unambiguous strategy that emerged from across a wide swath of stakeholders there. But I think returning to a little bit of a macro view of this table, I think it can be instructive in helping us see places of alignment and differences in emphasis across these three areas. And I think this perspective helps us understand how recent engagement efforts relate to our established climate frameworks and some of the themes that I've talked about today. I also think it highlights areas that might warrant further research or additional discussion and some ongoing monitoring as we move forward with this work. But I think by considering our efforts through this lens, we can view how current actions contribute to our broader climate objectives while also staying aware of emerging changes and trends. And I think this really offers adaptability in implementation as circumstances change and new information is obtained. And so just to close out, some takeaways from this research and really thinking about the last couple of weeks of conversations that we've been having on this. I think first, this research really illustrates how cities are pursuing a wide range of approaches to try and reduce fossil fuel use in new buildings. A lot of these approaches are driven by the unique circumstances, their local priorities, where they're located, the state they're in, and the evolving legal landscape. I think it also really highlighted to staff that as technology advances and as the policy landscape evolves, cities are constantly adapting in response, and we're doing that here too. Second, I think as we consider the bigger picture of our climate work, I think we can definitely see some common threads connecting staff research, CAP 2.0, and some of the decarb strategies that staff presented last week. And I think third, the policy environment continues to evolve, and staff are going to continue to monitor developments in this space, which I think is an approach that should position us to make progress towards our goals while navigating what is a complex and changing environment. And I think similar to last week, I realize staff have covered a lot of ground in a short window of time, so I'm happy to answer any questions. And with that, we'll hand things back to Mayor Binnis.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's a massive amount of information that you have coalesced into a very sort of discrete list of things. I very much appreciate that final table of sort of bringing us back into our sort of current context. So I want to thank you for developing that, and I'm sure there are going to be many questions as time goes. But I'll start out with Alan.
Thank you. Yeah, compliments to Ian and his staff. It's incredibly good work. Nice job. It was very thorough, and thanks for doing all that. 2 years ago, I called for a work session on climate change and homelessness revenue for actions. Didn't have much interest back then, but I'm glad that we're finally moving forward and coming back to this. And I've mentioned several times that the Biden administration, through the legislation that they passed, have actually made available hundreds of millions of dollars of funds to Oregon to incentivize climate actions. And I think the navigator position will be really key in helping our citizens in Eugene take advantage of those incentives and move us forward and getting our fair share of that money. I'm also eager to see us move forward after all this public engagement and the clarification of where we're heading with this. I think it's really like a step forward, especially in creating an implementation work plan for the 6 themes and the 16 strategies. I think that will be really well received and good work that the staff will be doing over the next couple of months. I know there's a motion on that coming up. On the revenue side, I'm calling for this for a long time, but I'm very interested in moving forward and getting more information on the climate impact fee, carbon tax, franchise fees, and other ideas that could bring money to the table so that we could fund these climate actions. But I'm also very interested in making sure that we have equity at the top of our list concerns when we do that. We don't want to inadvertently create hardships with, or purposefully create hardships with low-income people that are already having a hard time playing. If the Northwest Naturals rate increase gets approved this fall, low-income gas users will have seen a 50% increase in their cost since 2020, and that's got to be a hardship for them and difficult. So we need to make sure that when we're working on this, we take that into consideration, put that at the top of our minds. And I'll need another round, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Randy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Ian and Danielle. I think you've done a really tremendous job on this. I like the way it was presented, and I do appreciate the outreach you have been doing. I want to echo what Councilor Zelenka just said regarding concern for our low-income residents and how different steps we take will affect them. The other thing that I think is important that I haven't been able to get good answers on yet because we don't really know where we're going exactly, but I think having information on the local economic impacts is going to be important as well too. We don't want to be losing jobs. We don't want to be driving companies out of our community, or those that are looking to locate here, as I've said before, give them a reason to go somewhere else when we need this in our own city. I've always favored incentives as opposed to blunt force policy saying you can't do something. So I'll be more interested in incentives that we can come up with. But I'm really concerned about the cost, and I'm concerned about what we can do to make sure our employers stay here. That's all I have for now, but I may need another round. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay and then Mike.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Ian, again. I'm so impressed with the work that you've done, and I'm so appreciative of all of the effort that it took to bring this information back to us. Between last week's presentation and today's, we've learned about so many ways that we can continue our work to reduce carbon emissions in our city. I particularly loved the matrix of where our community engagement is meeting with the strategies that you've outlined and can work for us moving forward. And so to me, the next steps are to dive in deeper on a lot of these things, learn more about how we can implement a lot of these strategies. What's it going to take? What funding levels are we going to need to implement them? And what regulatory actions need to happen? So in particular, I'm interested in pursuing how we can create these additional incentives and navigation for these incentives, particularly for our low-income households, and especially those that are currently on gas and need to transition to electric, and where they can't receive those incentives at the moment. I'm interested in looking at our city-owned properties and our city-subsidized properties and what we can do to have, go carbon free on our own city-owned properties. I'm really interested in our emissions in the idea of the emission standards and appliance low NOx standards, and what the legal and community landscape is around that topic. I'd like to dive in a little deeper on that, and monitor what Ashland is doing and other places are doing across time, and how we can advocate at the state level for state policy. So it's very clear to me that we need dedicated funding sources. So I would like to move forward in learning more about the possibilities and impacts of increasing the supplier tax, as well as a climate impact fee. And these sources of funding have been, we've started to vet them through the Revenue Committee as viable for completing this work. And I like how they can be tools for both incentivizing and disincentivizing gas usage. So I'm looking forward to continuing to talk about these things. And again, thank you so much for your work.
Hey, thank you. Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Ian, thank you. And also Danielle for all of the efforts over time here. And certainly that report and that presentation shows a multitude of options of things we might do. And I think it was interesting to me at the end when you were mentioning how to look at common themes and how to look at grouping potential actions together. A part of this work for me comes down to a little bit of confusion that I see in how we talk about it. And I think it can help us with, focusing in on which actions to take at which time and in which way. And I too agree that incentives are the best way to go, as opposed to making things more expensive for any particular group of people. The confusion for me seems to come in how we talk about this work. And I'm hoping that we get to a place where we're talking about this as either decarbonization or electrification. Those are two completely different things in my mind. And I'd really like us to focus, they lead to completely different policy suggestions. And I'd like to see us personally focus in on decarbonization, because I think that's the issue that we're talking about when it comes to climate impact. Electrification seems to prescribe a particular set of things to do that may or may not be affordable, that may or may not be particularly helpful when it comes to climate change. So I want, and the measurable outcomes that come from that. So I'd appreciate it if we were focused in on decarbonization strategies as opposed to using those words interchangeably. One of the other reasons why that's important to me is that it seemed from a lot of the community feedback that we got, and good job with that, that resilience and reliability was a big part of this. And so I brought up at the end of the last meeting for us to have some ongoing manner in which we have the ability to check in and to be able to measure ongoing capacity from eWeb, and with the things that are proposed to come on board as new draws and demands on electricity. I hope that if we're focused on decarbonization, we have an ability to have further options other than just pure electrification as an option. So I have concerns that points towards much larger costs for the community if we're focused that way. So thank you.
Hey, thank you. Actually, I don't see a hand raised. I know Alan may want a second round, but I'm just going to jump in for a minute because, Mike, as you were talking about language and you were concerned, I was also thinking the word resilience. And at the state level, when the REACH code didn't make progress 2 years in a row, it was the legislature went back and created a committee that I sat on around resilient buildings so that we could embrace that sort of broader concept. And so I do think that language is helpful. I just wanted to highlight a couple of the slides, which I think maybe didn't show up in the final matrix, but resonated with me. And the first on the incentives, we heard from a number of different levels, but certainly also from the Blue Ribbon panel. We have a long history with the Bold Steps Award of sort of recognizing industries that sort of move in the direction that we support. I mean, with the Bold Steps Award, it was the triple bottom line. And we have an opportunity to really think about some of our allies in the business community that are working hard to create a more resilient industry, to diversify, to decarbonize, to reduce their transportation costs, introduce the impact of their building use of fossil fuels. So I think there are some not very expensive incentives. They don't all require that we create a whole new system that has to be funded. And some of that is that relationship building and information sharing across building sectors. And I heard that from my Blue Ribbon panel, as well as hearing that from the engagement that Danielle and Ian undertook. And then the other piece that resonated with me as an action is the building performance standards. We know we have industries in this community that are going to be required to comply with that state law. Ian has said to me there are about 100 of those. And so we have a sort of direct need to reach out to those businesses and help them understand. So there's some, I think within this larger list, it's a very big list. And we're obviously, as Ian said, it's not a menu, like we're not going to do them all. But we can track a lot of this, but there's some that in my mind sort of rise to the top because there's state legislation that always requires us to act, or we have heard from engagement that this is an immediate need. And so I just wanted to highlight a couple of those that I think, resonate. And then finally, just thinking about what we are trying to do, which is overall to build a resilient community that where people live and work in buildings that are responsive to these dramatic shifts in climate, and that we can do that with whatever energy system. I mean, we emphasize electric because our electricity is so clean, but I'm very excited about the possibility of geothermal exploration and some of those other pilots. And I'm going to be eager to see what happens in other communities as they do that. Okay, I'm out of time. So Alan, Alan, did you also want a second?
Yes, please.
So Alan and, oh wait, hold on. No, Jennifer gets her first round, then Alan, then Lindsay for their second.
Sorry, I actually thought my hand was up because I am not paying attention. So thank you, Ian, for your presentation today, and Danielle for the one before. I think these two sessions combined are really encouraging to hear how much work is going on and throughout our country, and people that are really grappling with the same issues that we're grappling with, and how they've found different ways of dealing with that are very varied, and also how much agreement we've found in our own community and places where we can connect. And I appreciate that those slides where it kind of showed us where things connect, and with our CAP and with the things we've just heard and the things that we're learning and kind of bringing it all together. And I like how you said, Ian, it's not a menu, because we already have other things that may be on the list and they may be not, that we might want to do if we're not restricted to just what other folks are doing. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I had a question. Oh, right. You were talking about building performance standards and how the state is working on that. And then you mentioned how benchmarking often comes before that. So did that already happen, or are we kind of doing that right now, or?
So that's going to be, yeah. So the state's a little bit building the airplane while they're flying it. So what they're doing is so they have a tiered system. And so certain building types are going to be subject to a building performance standard, but they will have to benchmark first. And then based on that benchmarking, they will then have a standard. And then there's a second tier of buildings that are either going to have to just do benchmarking, and that's like universities, schools, residential, or a certain size threshold. And then the state is going to use that information to think about whether they would expand the building performance standard to some of these buildings that aren't included in the rule right now. But yeah, you do the benchmarking first to understand what your energy use is in the buildings. And then you create a standard based on that. And again, just to clarify, I don't think I said this, these are for large commercial buildings. So in the state, it's basically buildings over 25,000 square feet. The rule will be 35,000 square feet, and then the benchmark will be 25,000. So it's really large buildings. It's not like individual homes or smaller buildings that are included.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm not sure how to ask this question, but I noticed there was, there were a lot of communities that are, supporting businesses and helping them meet their climate goals. And, we know jobs in electrification are good jobs. And I'm wondering, are there cities that are leveraging their climate goals to help support increasing jobs in that area? Are there programs like that?
There definitely are. What we saw is that typically is in bigger cities. And so we're seeing those in cities over 500,000 where maybe they have more resources, or there's maybe more of that marketplace to work with. But yes, there's a workforce that's a really important piece of this. And there are definitely cities who are focusing on that. And some of the training is for that, and understanding that there are going to be changes in this transition, and how to manage that in a sort of equitable, intentional way is something that is front and center for a lot of cities thinking about this.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Alan and then Lindsay for second round.
Yeah, it was a really good point, Jennifer. Workforce and jobs in this sector are really are actually an incredible co-benefit to doing this kind of work. The state did an analysis called the Tigger analysis, and in that they looked at electrification things and decarbonization actions, and looked at the net change in employment, and it was a positive net gain of well over 200,000 jobs over the next 10 years or so that would result from doing this, beside net benefits to everybody at a financial level, because saving energy saves money, and it's usually very cost effective to do that. The building performance standard program that the mayor mentioned that came out of that legislative committee that she was working on looks at the existing buildings that are in our mix, and they have to bring for those at the bottom half of the group, they have to bring their energy use up to the average for similar type buildings. So, and there will be some incentives for early adopters in that process. So that's another thing that the Navigator can help us get at, and being able to get our businesses to be able to do that, because they have to do it anyway. If they do it beforehand and get early adopter incentives, that makes sense to me. Ian, Daniel, just really good work. I really like the connection and the linkage back to CAP 2.0. There's so much good stuff in there. But I would also add in there that there are two other parts of that. I think it's a trio, the CRO, but also there were motions that were made by me that have the capital improvements program, the CIP, and the transportation plan, the TSP. Both of those plans have lots of infrastructure built in them, and they have to show how they support and further the CRO. So I'd like to see that added in there too, because those are big, important parts of this as well. And then finally, just want a word of caution about us getting into the air regulatory business. It's not a small deal. Becoming an air quality regulator is a pretty big deal. To do this, you need the science, you need findings, you need staff, you need permits, you need an enforcement process. All of that stuff needs to get put in place. That's why we rely on state DEQ and LRAPA to do that for us. So I'm not sure we want to duplicate what they already do and recreate all that. Wouldn't be cheap, wouldn't be fast. So looking at statewide action on setting those goals is probably a really good pathway for us to pursue as well. Right on the button.
Right on the button. Well done. Okay, thank you. I have Lindsay and then Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I wanted to respond to Councillor Clark's comment about electrification versus building decarbonization, and just a note that there's a lot of reports that say that it is the cheapest and most affordable pathway to building decarbonization. There are a lot of other options that just are very much more expensive. And I want to reiterate Mayor's point about this isn't just about our work on decarbonization. It's also directly in response to our changing climate. I think the recent heat waves should really show us how important it is for our community members and their quality of life to be able to have the ability to cool their homes and the right to cool their homes. And so, I'm looking at this work really as caring for our people and helping them ensure that, and providing incentives in particular to our lowest income people to be able to transition into, a heat pump that can both heat and cool a home and do that affordably. So, 15 years ago when I moved here, I didn't have an air conditioner in my home. I didn't feel like I need one. Today's climate is different, and I definitely feel that we need ability to cool our homes here in the summer. And so I'm looking at this work and feeling, really passionate about creating pathways for incentives that are going to allow that to happen and get people air conditioning. So I'm just so excited about this work, and I'm looking forward to our next steps.
Thank you. Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. Ian, I'm not sure. I can't remember when you started with the city. Has it been, how long has it been now? Because I'm going to reference a discussion that I think was prior to you, but I don't remember.
I started in September of 2022.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, it may have been just about then. We were having discussions still some time ago about the potential for a new franchise agreement. And while that was still on the table and the city was still having those discussions, I made myself kind of a pain in the backside to Sarah on several occasions to try and push that. Because I thought that the outcome that was possible was something Alan spoke quite a bit about. Us being the first in the state to take advantage of an 844 agreement, I think was a good opportunity at that time. And I want to know if that's still an opportunity at this time, because if we had done that at the time, we're talking about $1 million a year or better, millions in any event, no matter what the number ends up, that we would be using right now to help low-income folks better weatherize their homes, which gets to what Lindsay was saying and several others. So I want to know, where are we with that as a potential revenue source of looking at taking advantage of that? I think it was Senate Bill 844, right, Sarah?
I'm going to jump in for you, Ian, since I was actually here and was negotiating that, unless you have an answer and you're like,
Oh, I was going to look at you and say that predates
Okay.
my time with the city.
So I think this is two parts, Councilor Clark. As you might recall, I know it's been a little while, but the Northwest Natural actually stopped that negotiation effort when you started talking about the decarbonization piece. So that's kind of why it stopped. We didn't ever stop negotiating with them.
So
So
we're still willing to move ahead on that?
Two questions for you. The first question would be, I don't know if they would want to entertain that. We were trying to get to a franchise agreement. The second piece is, would council as a whole want to continue to go down that road of a franchise agreement? Because I was getting sort of the direction, checking in with you, talking about how these two things go together. Remember, we talked about the paperclip versus the staple. And if council still would want to pursue that as an option, a franchise agreement with an 844, they might be open to it. I'm not sure, but what's unclear to me is whether council today would want to actually pursue that.
Well, then I guess, thank you, Sarah. I guess I would just say, here's an opportunity, whether Alan's point being taken that gas prices, and especially for low income homeowners, are going and renters are going to increase. There's also a fairly massive increase slated for eWebs rates. There's also a number of other things that weigh in on energy pricing as we go into the fall here. There was a letter from Jeff McGilvery, I believe, that listed about 8 of them. And maybe, Ian, you could reflect on that too and help us understand the cost impacts that are heading our way. But we could be right now receiving money to help with weatherization with an agreement that's possible. And I think that's something we should at least be exploring, as opposed to a new tax or an increase in rates. So I want to advocate to my colleagues for that. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to just quickly dovetail on what Councilor Clark said. I mean, the weatherization piece, the incentive piece has always been my preferred action as well. And I've also said in the past, I think our strategy should be to reduce energy use, period, regardless of type, and moves us in the right direction. If we reduce even electrification use, that provides more capacity to add things into. So it's trying to look at this whole situation with the full lens and not getting tunneled into a particular piece of it. But also as we try to bring and pull the community together, I mean, I think we all recognize the ban was a divisive move. And as we move to bring people together, weatherization is one of the great equalizers. Plus, if you look at our low income people, most of them live in pre-1995 construction, whether they rent or own. And pre-1995 construction has some of the lowest energy ratings as far as insulation, windows, etc. So this just seems like a great jump off point to be trying to focus some of our efforts on the weatherization piece with, incentives and working with our utilities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Alan has a third, but I did want to respond to that a little bit. I mean, I think eWeb is a really valuable partner here, and they have done a lot of weatherization work. But I think that at the end of the day, people need air conditioning, and weatherization is not going to solve that problem. So, I think we can't just do one thing, and there are opportunities for us to take advantage of federal funds that would help us in addition to what we might decide to do locally. But in the more immediate term, I mean, the state is committed to heat pumps. There are other avenues. And so I think it would, and I think we need to have some confidence that eWeb, I mean, they have their integrated resource plan. They're looking at what their balance needs to be going forward. And so I don't think that the council as a decision-making body needs to make energy resources our decision. I think we need to work closely with our partners about what they're able to do. And I think Ian has done a really good job of having those ongoing conversations. So I just want to get us in the weeds of something that's really way out of our expertise when we have a really excellent utility here that can do that work and inform us. Okay, so now I have, let's see, I've got Alan and, I've got Emily for a first round. Emily, go for it.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Danielle and Ian. Your presentations are incredible. I really appreciate the depth of your investigation and the depth of your engagement. Obviously, this is a controversial topic, and the more input we can get, the better. Having worked on the franchise team quite a few years ago with Alan and Claire, we put a ton of work into it, and then all of a sudden it fell apart. I think we should be continuing to pursue this. It hasn't been changed in many, many years. And if we could use that money to help the poorer people have more efficient energy use, that would be really helpful. Absolutely agree that the biggest thing we need to do is reduce energy use. Weatherization is great for that, more efficient appliances would really help. I actually think weatherization, although not as dramatic as in the winter, does help in the summer because it creates a barrier between the two temperatures. So there would be a side effect from that. But over my years here, I have certainly noticed an increase in the hot weather, and for people to have electric heat pumps that would work both would be a really big advantage. I think we need to be careful of not being divisive. And, you can't please everybody, but you can please them a little bit. So incentivizing electricity, I think, is really important, decreasing use. But I think we need to be careful of saying we're going to eliminate gas usage. Obviously, people with gas fireplaces think survival can depend on that. So I want to be careful of telling people they absolutely cannot. I'd rather work on the things they can do. I think that in the long run, it will be more cost effective and more effective for our current climate challenges. I want to stay open to all ideas. I also think it's time to approve at least some of them and make some forward motion, being really careful to weigh in all that engagement and realize that there are a lot of different segments of opinion in this city, and they're not all vocal. So we need to continue this great work. I'm really excited to see where it leads us. Thank you.
Hey, Alan and then Lindsay.
Well said, Emily. I agree with that wholeheartedly. One of the things that what the mayor brought up made me think that given the urgency of climate action, pace and timing of different types of actions is really important, and we need to take that into consideration. Some actions are really quick and others take a lot of time, even years, like weatherizing homes and putting in heat pumps and getting appliances in place will take years to actually transition to 10 to 15 in some cases. if we work at it hard, and we're not even at that level right now. I think, and then finally, the mayor's point about working through our partners is really a good one. You know, we have some really good partners that can help us do this versus us reinventing the wheel. You know, working with UWeb, working with Northwest Natural, working with DEQ and LRAPA. We don't have to take on everything. We can work through our partners to make things happen, and advocate for things at the state level and at the local level as well. So I think that's a really good point that the mayor made.
Thank you. Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you. Really quickly, just want to mention that, yes, weatherization is incredibly important, and we should be, also focusing on that moving forward. But a reminder that current eWeb customers that have gas heating actually can't access incentives for weatherization until they transition to electric energy source. So the idea of a dedicated source of funding for incentive programs would allow people to access weatherization incentives as well as replacing their appliances. So I just wanted to clarify that piece as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Emily.
Thanks. Thank you, Lindsay, for bringing that up. That's really important. I have a 100-year-old house with gas, and when I look into using electricity instead, I can't use them because I don't have electric heat. So if we could work with that, I think it would really help. So thanks.
Sorry, I was on mute. I know we have a couple of counselors with motions, and Jennifer, is that why your hand is currently raised? Okay, so if there's no other sort of general discussion, I'm gonna open the floor for Jennifer's motion first.
Yeah, thanks. I was trying to wait for a lull, but it's kind of hard with this group. Before I say it, I just want to appreciate this conversation. At least from my perspective, I think there's a lot of agreement in certain areas just within our council, and it's really encouraging to hear that. Okay, I have to try to see, have two things on my screen so I can read. Okay. So I'm going to move to direct the city manager to return to council prior to the end of 2024 for a discussion of the potential revenue sources that were identified by the revenue advisors for funding decarbonization and greenhouse gas emission reduction efforts, with an emphasis on serving low-income households, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and other disadvantaged households.
Second.
Thanks, Alan. And just real quickly, I'll just say I really appreciate how folks have identified that our low-income households are in special need of a lift up and support. And we know climate change adversely affects those same populations. So if things, as things get worse, they're going to be the ones bearing more of the burden than others. And so that's why I incorporated that into this motion, because I think it's really important for us to keep a focus and to remember that as we're creating policies. So thank you.
Okay, well, that has elicited a lot of hand raising. So I've got Alan, then Mike, then Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I was going to make a similar point to what Jennifer said in helping craft this motion. That's particularly important that we focus on the equity impacts of the things that we're doing. But there are other things that we need to look at very carefully when we're doing this analysis. Coming back to us, the how do you implement this? What are the implementation details? What is the amount of revenue that we can get for these? What are the pros and cons of doing each one of these? They're all very different types of analysis or types of mechanisms, and then reemphasizing that equity component to it, not only the low income people but the disadvantaged community members in Eugene. So a more comprehensive look is what I'm expecting to get back from us. The stuff that was done at the revenue advisors that Lindsay and I were on was very good, and it's a great jumping off point to do a little bit more detail, a little bit more focus. But those are great starting points.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and then Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. Jennifer, I want to vote in support of this, but there were two things that said that I just want to check in on with you to make sure I understood them right. Ian's going to come back to us with the potential for a broad variety of revenue sources, or were they restricted in some way to particular revenue sources in that motion? I didn't understand that language very well. Could you?
Yeah, so the motion would restrict them to the things that were discussed in the revenue advisors group. So that would be the climate impact fee, the supplier tax, and then bond levy situation. I think that's the three, right, Ian?
And a carbon tax is in there.
Oh,
too.
right.
Yeah, that's the fourth one.
If you were willing to take a friendly to have him come back with all potential revenue sources, as opposed to just those particularly prescribed ones, you'd have my vote. The other was whether or not your motion was particularly directed or not at rental units in our community, because, or do you think that your motion allows for special consideration of those in a different way than owned homes?
Well, so it's not about how the money would be used, but I would say that when you're thinking about how the taxes or whatever the funding source might affect, that I think renters would fall into folks who we would consider to be in a disadvantaged group, right? They don't own their property. So I think so since it doesn't focus on how it's being used, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question right.
Would you accept the friendly? I want him to look at some of the other things that were mentioned. For example, what would it take? What kind of money would we get from Northwest Natural if we had a franchise agreement reinstated? And how would we be constrained to use that money? Other potential sources of that nature. The ones prescribed for me seem like they could be disincentives, and I would prefer to focus on incentives. So I want to look at all range of opportunity for revenue sources. Would you accept that, a broader range of revenue sources as a friendly?
Well, the point was to build on work we've already been doing, and the franchise fee supplier tax is already in there. So I guess no. I'm sorry.
What I would hate to see is for information to come back and us already get to a place where we're only considering some of the potential options that several of which have consequences we don't agree with or wouldn't want to see, unintentional consequences we wouldn't want to see. So that's why I want to give him broader leeway for that. I'm just looking for a little bit of give here so I can support it.
I mean, if you have a specific thing you would like to ask, but I'm not going to tell him go out and find every revenue source imaginable and come back. That doesn't seem reasonable as an ask. That's why we had the revenue team.
I can see Alan wanting to answer this question. And the reason is also there are multiple, both state and federal revenue sources that are available, several of which I know he's mentioned before, that I would like to see us considering other than just the ideas. And I've mentioned a couple over the last couple of meetings that I'd like to see us be considering a broader range of potential options so that we might expand the work itself too, if there were monies available from several sources. So that's all I'm asking.
Alan, as the seconder of this motion, do you want to speak to this? Sorry, Randy, I'm just going to jump in there.
Yeah, the way the motion's written, Mike, it says revenue source identified by the revenue advisors. So this is the book. There's like 45 different revenue sources in here that were looked at, including those 4. Motion doesn't say just those 4. It says everything. So I think what you're asking for is included because everything's already in here from debt to other kinds of things. So if you wanted to make it even clearer, you could say,
Considered
or,
by.
yeah, yeah. But identified, there's a ton of them in here. It's almost 50.
Happy to go with that.
So I think you're covered.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, Randy?
Thank you, Mayor. Jennifer, I want to support this as well, but I'm going to have a problem voting to move anything forward this fall unless I understand what some of the economic impacts are going to be. And we have a level of analysis on that as well. So in the interest of time, is there a way we could include that in your motion?
You want to get information about how it would affect people.
Well, the cost effect on
Right.
not just individuals, although that's important too, but I also want to understand what is that doing to our business community, to our employers, and make sure we have a handle on that and find if how do we neutralize that? How do we minimize that?
So the intention is to get back the information folks would need to then make further decisions. So I assume that type of analysis would be included. And this is a great opportunity to let staff say, does that also your understanding? Because that was my understanding.
Yeah.
This isn't the first time we've gotten information about taxes, and that type of information is always included. So I just
want to make sure that that's included, because otherwise it's another delay from my standpoint, and I don't want to do that.
That was included in the revenue advisor's work that the staff did. So there's like 10 things that each one of them looked at, including fairness and indirect implication, who pays, all sorts of things.
I'm going to let the manager respond to that.
I was just, and I saw Matt had his hand raised too, so may have a better answer. What I was going to say is we do have some of the broader information, but what I was imagining would happen is if we're really bringing back everything, that at some point council is going to have an interest in one or two things. Potentially you're going to narrow it, and then we can do a much deeper dive with what that impact is. But so maybe I'm just misunderstanding. It would be difficult to do a really deep dive on every one of them, especially if that's not something you're planning on pursuing.
That makes sense what you're saying. I'm just saying it's going to be hard for me to take the next vote and vote yes without knowing what the consequences are. And I don't care what it is we do, there's always consequences, often unintended. And I'd just like to know where we're getting ready to step as we go into this, because we're certainly going to get asked about that.
Absolutely. I wouldn't expect anyone to implement something without understanding the ramifications. So,
right.
Thank you.
Right. And I think that everyone understands this is an iterative process. We're getting layers of information. We got the first round from the revenue committee. Now we're asking for the next round to address our concerns about how we invest in climate work. So
I just want to get it on the record that this is important. So,
yeah,
thank
I
you.
think we're all of like mind.
Okay.
Okay. So with that, if there are no other further questions, we have a motion. It's been seconded on the table. All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Who am I missing?
Matt.
Oh, I'm missing Matt. Okay. All right. Thank you. So that passes 7-0. Thank you all. That's excellent. And now I know that Lindsay also has a motion to put on the table.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Move to direct the city manager to return to council prior to the end of 2024 to discuss a potential pathway forward for implementing the strategies presented by staff to decarbonize homes and buildings in Eugene, and monitoring regulatory actions being taken by other jurisdictions for possible local adoption.
Second.
Okay, Lindsay, do you want to speak to that?
Just for a moment, I think, this work is incredible. It needs to be taken to the next step, which is looking at how we implement these things moving forward. What do we need, funding wise, resource wise, staff wise, in a timeline for how to do that work. And looking at kind of the legal and community landscape of things like the emissions standards. What does that look like for Eugene? How could we implement it here if it makes sense? And so just taking us to the next step in potential for some of these items that we've been learning about today and last week.
Okay, thank you. Mike and then Alan.
If Lindsay would accept a friendly that was very much along the lines of what Councillor Grove said, I would be willing to vote for that, and the potential consequences, financial and otherwise.
Could you clarify exactly what the friendly would be?
Adding those words so that, for example, when we're taking decarbonizing steps, amongst all of the choices that we have and the things that we're told about today in broad generalities, some of those specifics may have other consequences. For example, I asked on multiple occasions about the capacity for electrification of particular amounts or not. When we're considering, for example, the idea of incentivizing changing over to heat pumps with X% of the homes in the city, what effect does that have on power capacity, power rates, other economic considerations when it comes down to what those decarbonizing efforts would mean? I just want it to be a hand-in-hand scenario, much like what Randy said, that when we're considering implementing things, we're considering the potential costs and unintended consequences as well. So I just wanted to add that language to the end and the potential consequences.
Yeah,
is that a friendly you can accept?
Can I just for clarification where the friendly would fall? You said at the end, but the way I initially heard it would be
prior to other communities.
So it would be moved to direct the city manager to return to council prior to the end to discuss a potential path forward and potential consequences for implementing strategies and monitoring. Is that where you want it?
Correct.
Okay.
I can accept the friendly.
Yeah, as a second, that's fine.
Okay, so Alan, did you have more comments to make? Or
Yes, Mayor. So what I would expect staff, and I'd like to hear what they think they were going to bring back to us, but what do we need? The way I think about it is similar to what Mike and Lindsay are talking about, but kind of in a broader sense. What do we need to know? What is the analysis you need to do in order for us to know that the information we need to know to make all these strategies and themes actionable? So if we're going to implement them, what do we need to know in order to get there? So that's kind of the detailed work of a work plan. Right now we've got the broad brush scopes. Now you got to figure out, okay, if we're going to do this, here's how it would work. Here's what we do. Here's how it would be impacted. Here's what would happen, blah, blah, blah. Kind of interesting what staff thinks that they would bring back in the work plan that they already said they were going to do anyway.
So I don't think we were necessarily thinking another plan, but I think we were trying to figure out like a path forward for doing this work. I think we've got a lot of plans. And so the CAP is our plan. You know, we've got a bunch of other plans that exist right now, but I think this was a way to figure out focus, who was going to maybe be the lead. There's a number of things going back to last week with the strategies that the city's not going to be a lead. We're going to require partners. The partner may be the lead. So there's conversation that has to happen, understanding who the lead is, figuring out what the budget might be, at what scale, where the source of funding might come from. There might be existing funding. It might be from the state. It might be from IRA. So I think that's part of the exercise that we're going to go to next, particularly in thinking about the strategies. I think there are certain things that we think can roll out relatively quickly. We think with our existing budget, with our existing staff, that we can start developing outreach and awareness programs. Like I think there's certain things that can roll out. So a lot of that again is kind of laying out that Gantt chart of what's going to be needed. There's certain things that are going to need state enabling legislation, like a geothermal energy network at any type of scale probably needs state legislation. And so we'll continue to have that conversation, track what other people are doing. But I think that was our thinking, and it wasn't going to render itself as a plan, but it was going to lay out kind of that's just a term that feels like it's a very official thing, whereas we're trying to figure out how these strategies are being implemented. I think on the tracking what others are doing, I think that's the part I would want to clarify, and I'm curious if Emily Jerome has a thought. I think we're going to be looking at what's going on in Ashland and other jurisdictions, but this is all uncharted legal territory. And I think it's going to take a very long time to understand what the implications of this are going to be. And so it's not going to be something we're going to have an answer on in December. I think we may know what they've done. Maybe they've created an ordinance, they might have passed it, but how that then goes through the court system, it's going to be challenged. And so how that goes through the court system is something that's going to take many years. You know, there's legislation going on in California at their air resource board level, we're tracking as well. And so a lot of those kind of legal fights and jostling is going to go on for a couple of years. And so understanding what that might mean currently legally is one of those things that I think it needs more time than coming back at the end of this year or early next year. But I'll defer to the city attorney or if Emily Drome has a thought on that.
I just wanted to clarify something. I wasn't saying we build a whole new plan, but what you've got is you've got these 6 themes and these 16 strategies. The work plan involves what's the details of each one of these? What's the priority? We can't do them all at the same time. Who we're going to work with? How are we going to do that? It's the implementation part of yes. the stuff that you put forward because it's the path forward, and you obviously can't do everything at once because we only have you two great stuff.
So that's exactly what we'll be doing is laying all of that out, and we'll be able to see pretty quickly that this is going to require these 3 things to be put in place before we could take anything further. And so that will be the next phase of work that we're going to be really focusing on.
And where's the biggest decarbonization bang for the buck?
Okay, this is like turning into popcorn, and I don't actually want it to turn into popcorn. So I have Randy as next in line.
Thank you, Mayor. And I just wanted to confirm that we will be getting a legal analysis with this. And my understanding is that a mandate to electrify, for example, is really the inverse of a gas ban. Is that correct, attorneys?
I wouldn't necessarily say it in those broad of terms. We know what we can't do because Berkeley illustrated that. Right. I don't know if you noted that in the AIS, we mentioned that the court came back and amended its decision in 2024 to kind of back off a little bit and said, yes, what Berkeley's doing is not okay. And I think we can take from that what we were trying to do with our previous ordinance is not okay. It's preempted by that federal law. But they were very clear that they were not commenting on other things. Okay. And so depending on what you mean by electrification, but generally, yes, we're working hand in hand with Ian. Right now, he's really presented so many options and ideas for a direction for you. It's been difficult for us to really sink a lot of legal research into each of these. As they focus more into what this jurisdiction wants to do, absolutely, we won't be bringing you things that we know you cannot do. And we'll be here to answer questions and try to address your issues too with each of these sessions.
Thank you. And what I meant by that was saying there's only one type of energy you can use would be limiting. And I just wanted to understand how that was legally interpreted. I think we have a suite of things that can be done that probably don't cross any lines, but I just want to make sure, also the public listening know there still are some constraints with the Berkeley decision. Thank you.
Okay, everyone's hands went down. So Mike, you still have a comment? Anybody else needing to be in the queue? Okay, Mike, go for it.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to emphasize that I'm planning on voting in favor of Lindsay's motion because the language she used, Randy, was decarbonization, not electrify. So thank you.
Okay, so we have a motion. It's got a friendly amendment to it. Does anyone need to hear it again? Okay, it's been seconded. So all in favor, please raise your hands. 2, 3, 6, 7. So that passes 7-0. Thank you very much. That's really, Ian, again, fantastic work, full of information, full of promise. Thank you, counselors, for finding those next steps forward to sort of learn more, figure out where we have a pathway forward on all of these things, raising funds and what other options we might have to further our climate work. So I appreciate all that you have done. Thank you so much. And with that, we're actually adjourned 10 minutes early. So thank you.